What if the person you're forced to live with ends up being the one who completely changes your life? This isn't your typical college roommate story. It starts with a quiet freshman, someone who just wanted peace, a stack of books, and a little corner of the world to themselves. But what they got instead was the university's loudest, most charming, and most unpredictable wildcard, the football captain. Popular, fearless, and the last person you'd expect to share a room with someone who barely speaks up in class. In today's story, we're diving into what happens when two worlds collide under one roof. A bookworm and a football star, trapped in a small dorm room, trying to survive the semester. You'll see the tension, the awkward beginnings, the misunderstandings, and the slow, unexpected shift from strangers to something deeper. And trust me, there's a moment neither of them saw coming, one that changed everything. You'll find out what it's really like behind the smiles of campus celebrities, and why the quietest people often carry the most powerful stories. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single moment, an unplanned, unscripted walk-in, turned into something unforgettable. So stick around, because just when you think you know where this story is going, it takes a turn. Welcome to our channel. If you love true-to-life emotional stories with twists, vulnerability, and a little bit of chaos, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Let's get into it. The days that followed were a strange mix of chaos and awkwardness. The football captain, whose life seemed to revolve around practice, social events, and being the center of attention, didn't exactly blend into the quiet, studious environment the protagonist had hoped for. Every day felt like a test of patience, and the two personalities couldn't have been more different. The protagonist had always preferred peace, solitude, and books to loud parties and socializing. But here they were, in a small dorm room, stuck with someone who was the complete opposite. The roommate's loud music and late-night friends weren't just background noise, they were an ever-present reminder that their hopes for a quiet freshman year were slipping away. It wasn't just the noise that made things tense, it was the constant contrast between them. The protagonist tried their best to get through the day unnoticed, staying in their corner of the room, earbuds in, books open. Meanwhile, the roommate was out every evening, chatting with everyone from teammates to random strangers in the dorm. He had that effortless charm, the kind that attracted people without even trying. He was always at the center of attention, always joking, always moving. At first, there were only brief, awkward exchanges. A greeting here, a quick word there, nothing that ever lasted longer than a few seconds. It felt like the football captain didn't even notice how different they were, and that was a relief. But those small, awkward moments began to add up. The protagonist couldn't ignore the loud conversations that leaked into their personal space. They couldn't ignore the way their roommate would leave things scattered around, expecting them to just deal with it. And what about those late nights when the football captain would return, talking at the top of his lungs as if there was no one else in the world? Yet, in between the tension and miscommunication, there were glimpses of something unexpected. Sometimes, the roommate would leave his door open just a little too long, giving the protagonist a chance to overhear his own doubts. Other times, when they found themselves stuck together in the room, a brief conversation would pass, not about football or friends, but about life, school, and where they each saw themselves in the future. Even if those moments were few and far between, they were starting to show that there was more to the roommate than the loud persona he put on for everyone else. But even those small interactions didn't stop the growing tension. The protagonist tried to bury their frustration, but it was getting harder. They were out of their comfort zone, pushed to adapt in ways they never expected. They didn't want to confront their roommate, it wasn't in their nature. But the more they lived in close quarters, the more they realized that avoiding the issue wasn't going to solve anything. The football captain, on the other hand, had begun to notice the quiet presence of his roommate. At first, it seemed like they were just passing ships in the night, living their separate lives. But as the days went on, he couldn't help but wonder why the protagonist stayed so distant, so quiet. There was a story there, he could feel it. But he wasn't sure how to approach it without pushing too far. Neither of them knew yet how their lives would intertwine. Neither of them knew that these small moments of discomfort would build into something more significant. All they knew was that the longer they shared this tiny room, the more complicated their situation became. It was late one night when everything changed. The protagonist had been buried in their books as usual, the soft glow of their desk lamp the only light in the room. The sounds of the dormitory outside felt like distant echoes, footsteps in the hallway, muffled laughter, the usual chatter from the football captain's friends. But inside the room, it was peaceful. At least, it had been, until the door swung open without warning. The football captain stood in the doorway, frozen for a moment. His eyes widened, and for the first time, he looked completely off balance. It was clear he hadn't expected to find what he had. The protagonist, who had thought they were alone, was caught in the middle of a private moment, one they hadn't anticipated sharing with anyone, let alone their roommate. There was a rush of confusion, then immediate embarrassment. The protagonist's heart raced as they quickly tried to cover themselves, scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. The football captain didn't move, his eyes wide with surprise, before quickly looking away and muttering an apology. I'm so sorry, he stammered, his usual confidence shaken. I didn't mean, but the damage had already been done. The protagonist could barely find their voice, their face burning red with humiliation. The room, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt like a foreign place, one where privacy had been shattered in an instant. There was a long, heavy silence as both of them stood there, unsure of what to do next. The football captain took a few tentative steps backward, unsure whether he should leave or stay. Meanwhile, the protagonist sat there, heart still thumping in their chest, unsure if they should say anything, or if the silence was better. It wasn't until the football captain, awkwardly clearing his throat, finally spoke again. I'll give you some space. His voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. And with that, he left, quietly closing the door behind him. The protagonist didn't know how long they sat there after that, staring at the floor, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like an intrusion, like something deeply personal had been exposed without permission. The sting of embarrassment settled deep within, and the silence of the room felt deafening. The football captain, for his part, had retreated to his side of the room, his thoughts clearly racing. He couldn't get the image out of his head, the shock, the vulnerability, the way the protagonist had looked in that moment. He was used to walking in on people in the dorms, but never like this. Never in such an intimate, private way. And now, the guilt hung over him. He didn't know how to fix this, or if it was even something that could be fixed. Over the next few days, things were tense between them. Neither of them knew how to address what had happened. The football captain tried to be extra careful, avoiding the protagonist's space as much as possible, but the awkwardness was inescapable. Every time he passed by, every time their eyes met, there was a weight to the air that hadn't been there before. The protagonist, on the other hand, retreated even further into their shell. They barely spoke, preferring the company of their books and the soft hum of their music. But inside, it was a different story. The embarrassment lingered, the uncomfortable feeling of being exposed in a way they hadn't chosen. They couldn't shake the image of the football captain's eyes when he'd walked in. His reaction wasn't mocking or judgmental, but it was something else entirely. Something unsettling. But it wasn't just that. The more the protagonist thought about it, the more they realized how much they'd let themselves believe they were invisible. The football captain had always seemed like this untouchable figure, someone who never noticed the quiet people, the ones who sat in the back of the classroom and never spoke up. He was the center of attention, the one everyone else admired. The last person who would care about someone like them. Yet, there was something about that look on his face, the way he'd seemed genuinely sorry, that made the protagonist pause. It wasn't judgment in his eyes, it was something else. Was it sympathy, concern, or perhaps curiosity? The question lingered, unanswered, as the days passed. Neither of them knew how to talk about it, so they didn't. But the tension between them wasn't something that could be ignored forever. Eventually, something would have to give. They both knew that. And so, as the days stretched on, the football captain found himself wrestling with the awkwardness of the situation. He couldn't stop thinking about the protagonist, the quiet, introverted roommate who had become more than just someone to share a room with. There was something compelling about them, something that didn't match the labels he had slapped on people like them. He had seen the protagonist as just another student, just another face in the dorm. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. Something had shifted. Something had happened that neither of them had expected. And neither of them knew yet what that would mean. The days after the incident were a quiet, uneasy blend of avoidance and tentative steps toward normalcy. Neither the protagonist nor the football captain brought up what had happened, but the silence between them spoke volumes. It was clear that things had changed, but neither of them knew how to navigate the new, uncomfortable dynamic. For the protagonist, life had become a series of quiet rituals, avoiding eye contact, keeping headphones in whenever possible, and retreating into their books whenever they could. It wasn't that they were angry or upset, they just felt vulnerable, exposed in a way they hadn't been prepared for. They had always prided themselves on their ability to hide in plain sight, to blend into the background. Now, that was no longer an option. But what struck the protagonist most was the way the football captain had acted afterward. Despite the awkwardness, despite the discomfort, the captain seemed different. At first, it felt like he was overcompensating, trying too hard to pretend nothing had happened, to restore some sense of normalcy between them. But slowly, the protagonist began to notice something else. The football captain was giving them space, yes, but he was also starting to reach out in small, unexpected ways. He'd leave his door open just enough for a quiet, "Hey, you need anything?" Or, on rare occasions, a shared smile when their paths crossed in the hall. It wasn't much, but it was something. He wasn't avoiding them. He wasn't treating them like the embarrassing, silent mistake they both felt the incident had been. One evening, after a particularly long day of studying, the protagonist returned to the room to find the football captain sitting on his bed, looking through a set of football stats on his phone. The room was quiet, the hum of the dorm's hallway muffled outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was still there, but it was different now, less intense, more like a quiet undercurrent than a raging storm. Finally, the football captain broke the silence. "You're doing okay, right?" His voice was casual, but there was an edge of something deeper, genuine concern. It wasn't what the protagonist had expected from him. The captain, who was used to being surrounded by people, had always been the type to keep his distance from others when it came to real emotions. But now, he was standing in the open, offering something rare, vulnerability. The protagonist hesitated, unsure whether to answer honestly or to retreat into their usual guarded shell. But something in the football captain's voice, the sincerity, the lack of judgment, made them pause. "I'm fine," the protagonist muttered, barely looking up from their books. But even as the words left their mouth, they knew it wasn't true. They weren't fine. They felt out of place, exposed, unsure of where they stood. They just didn't know how to say it. The football captain, sensing the hesitation, shifted on his bed but didn't press further. "If you ever need to talk, or, just hang out. I'm here," he said quietly. His tone was different now, no bravado, no mask of confidence. Just someone, in that moment, trying to make things right. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't some dramatic, heartfelt apology. It was simple, honest, and offered without expectation. But for the protagonist, it felt like a crack in the wall that had been built between them. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they started to believe that maybe the football captain wasn't just some loud, arrogant jock. Maybe there was more to him, more than the surface-level bravado that everyone else seemed to love. And as for the football captain, he began to realize that maybe the protagonist wasn't just some quiet, invisible roommate. There was depth there, a quiet strength he hadn't expected to find. He had assumed that the protagonist was just another shy, bookish student, too introverted to ever stand out. But after the incident, after seeing how the protagonist had reacted, he started to wonder if he had misjudged them. There was something about them, a quiet resilience, that was both intriguing and humbling. Their late-night interactions grew more frequent, though they were still tentative. The football captain would offer to bring back coffee from late practices, or suggest they study together in the common room. And though the protagonist hesitated at first, they couldn't deny that there was something about these quiet moments that began to feel comfortable. Neither of them was entirely sure where this was leading, but the tension that had once defined their relationship was slowly being replaced by something else. Trust, however fragile, was beginning to form in the spaces between awkward silences and shy glances. But, of course, that didn't mean everything was perfect. There were still the moments of doubt, the times when the protagonist would catch the football captain talking to one of his friends in the hallway, laughing too loudly, their shared bond slipping back into the familiar discomfort. And the football captain still found himself caught in those moments when he wasn't sure how much to push, how much to reveal. But what had started as a collision of two very different worlds was gradually becoming something else, something unpredictable, something neither of them had expected. The small gestures, the shared conversations, the unsaid understanding, it was all slowly weaving them together in ways neither of them quite understood yet. And though neither of them could have anticipated how their story would unfold, one thing was certain: the path they were on now wasn't just about surviving college. It was about learning to navigate the uncharted territory of a new kind of relationship, one built not on expectations, but on the shared, often messy, but undeniable connection they were beginning to form. As the days continued to pass, the room between the protagonist and the football captain became something else, a place of uncertain friendship, fragile trust, and moments of quiet understanding. The tension that had once filled the space between them was gradually being replaced by a new kind of connection. Neither of them fully understood it yet, but both could sense the shift. The football captain's attempts at reaching out didn't stop with small gestures like offering coffee or inviting the protagonist to study. Slowly, the walls that had separated them began to crumble, bit by bit. There were more conversations now, conversations that started with mundane questions about school or assignments, but somehow always veered into more personal territory. It was one of those late evenings, with the quiet hum of the dormitory surrounding them, when the football captain sat down on the edge of his bed and finally asked, "What made you want to come to college?" His tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable curiosity in his voice. The protagonist was surprised by the question. They had gotten used to the football captain's usual questions about classes or study habits, but this was different. This was something deeper. It felt like he was actually trying to understand them, to see beyond the surface. The protagonist hesitated, unsure of how to answer. College had been a dream, a way out of their small town, a chance to finally prove to themselves that they could be more than just the quiet, invisible kid who sat at the back of the class. But it wasn't just about escaping. It was about discovering who they really were, beyond the labels that had been placed on them their whole life. "I guess, I just wanted to find a place where I could be myself," the protagonist said, their voice quiet but steady. "A place where I wasn't just the quiet kid or the bookworm. Where I could actually exist, you know." The football captain listened intently, his eyes softening as he absorbed the words. He wasn't used to hearing this kind of vulnerability from the people around him. He was used to being the one everyone looked up to, the one everyone thought had everything figured out. But here, sitting across from someone who wasn't trying to impress him, he found himself listening in a way he hadn't before. "Yeah," he said slowly, "I get that. I mean, I don't always show it, but sometimes I feel like people expect me to be this perfect, football guy. Like I can't be anything else." He shifted uncomfortably, as if admitting this out loud was harder than it sounded. "Sometimes I wish I could just be me." For a moment, there was a long silence between them, a silence that felt surprisingly comfortable. The football captain, usually the center of attention, had just opened up about something real, something that went beyond his reputation or his role on the team. And for the first time, the protagonist saw him in a new light, not just as the loud, charismatic football star, but as someone who, in his own way, was just as lost as they were. It was these moments, these quiet exchanges, that began to shift their relationship in ways neither of them had anticipated. No longer just two strangers forced into a shared space, they were starting to become two people trying to figure out who they were and who they wanted to be. But even as these moments of connection grew more frequent, there was still the lingering question: what was this between them? Was it just a friendship? Or was it something more, something that neither of them could quite put their finger on? The football captain didn't know. He had never really thought about it before. He was the guy everyone looked up to, the one who was always surrounded by people. Relationships had always been easy. For him, casual, simple, no strings attached. But with the protagonist, it felt different. There was a depth there that he couldn't ignore. And the protagonist, they were starting to feel the same way. For the first time in their life, they were truly seen. Not for their quietness, not for their introversion, but for who they really were. The football captain's small acts of kindness, his willingness to listen, had opened up something within them that they hadn't known was missing. Yet, As the days wore on, the question still hung in the air: what came next? Could they stay just roommates? Could they go back to the way things had been before, when there was nothing more than awkward exchanges and distance between them? Or was there something more growing between them, something that neither of them could easily define? The tension that had once been a burden had now shifted into something more like anticipation. Every glance, every word between them seemed to carry more weight than it ever had before. Neither of them knew what it meant, but they both felt it, this growing connection, this pull that neither of them had anticipated. As much as they tried to ignore it, as much as they told themselves that nothing had changed, both of them knew that things were different now. And neither of them knew what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel like they had to have all the answers. They didn't have to define what this was, whatever it was, right away. All they knew was that in the quiet moments, in the unexpected conversations, they were finding something real. And that, in itself, was enough for now. The days leading up to the end of the semester felt like a blur. The football captain and the protagonist had fallen into an unspoken rhythm, an understanding that neither of them fully articulated, but both of them felt. The tension that once hung thick in the air between them had faded, replaced by something that felt like a genuine, if somewhat complicated, friendship. But as finals approached and the pressure of academic life intensified, so did the growing sense of uncertainty. The protagonist was still navigating their own self-doubt and the fear of being too exposed, too vulnerable. They hadn't fully let go of the embarrassment from that day the football captain had walked in on them, though, with time, the sting had dulled. But now, they found themselves questioning everything. What had started as a chance encounter had evolved into something deeper, something more meaningful, but was it enough to sustain beyond the confines of their shared dorm room? The football captain, too, was struggling with his own questions. He found himself thinking about the protagonist more than he ever thought he would. They had become someone he genuinely cared about, not just as a roommate, but as a person. He couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard he tried. The easy, shallow friendships he had always relied on now felt distant, inadequate. The connection with the protagonist was different. It wasn't easy, but it was real. One evening, as they sat together in the small dorm room, both of them buried in their respective work, a heavy silence settled between them. The weight of unspoken words seemed to hang in the air. Finally, it was the football captain who broke the silence. "So, what happens after finals?" he asked, his voice unusually soft. "You know, when the semester's over." The question caught the protagonist off guard, and they looked up from their notes, meeting his gaze for the first time in days. There was something almost vulnerable in his expression, something that hadn't been there before. "I'm not sure," the protagonist replied, unsure of how to answer. "I guess I'll just go home for the break, and then come back next semester." The football captain nodded, but there was a quiet hesitation in his movements, a pause that suggested he was thinking about something more. The protagonist noticed the shift in his demeanor, the way he was suddenly hesitant, unsure. "You don't," he stopped himself, as if debating whether to continue. "I mean, we've been roommates for a while now, but I don't really know what you're planning for after this. It's just, I guess I'm trying to figure out what happens after all this." The words hung in the air, unspoken yet clear. What was next for them? Could this connection they'd built survive outside the small bubble of their dorm room? Would things change once they left the campus for winter break? Was there a possibility that what they had could be something more than just a college roommate arrangement? The protagonist's heart raced. They hadn't thought about it, about what would happen once the semester was over. The thought of parting ways, of leaving behind this unexpected connection, felt unsettling. They had grown used to the football captain's quiet presence, his small acts of kindness. The thought of losing that was more disconcerting than they had expected. "I don't know," the protagonist said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I hadn't really thought about it." The football captain leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant for a moment, lost in thought. "It's just, things have changed, right?" His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. "I didn't expect us to be like this." The protagonist nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in his words. They hadn't expected any of this unspoken bond, this growing understanding between them. It had started with an awkward incident, a simple mistake, but somewhere along the way, something had shifted. They weren't just two people sharing a space anymore. They had become something else, something undefined, but undeniable. I didn't expect it either, the protagonist admitted, their voice tinged with a mix of confusion and vulnerability. But it's been nice being able to talk to you. To just be around someone who gets it, even if we don't always say the right things. There was a long pause before the football captain spoke again, his tone more serious this time. Do you think we could keep this up after the semester ends? The question hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Neither of them knew what it meant, but they both knew that whatever it was important. They had shared something in the weeks since the incident, something real, something they hadn't expected to find in a dorm room or with someone so different from themselves. I don't know, the protagonist replied honestly, their heart beating faster with the weight of the question. But I'd like to try. If you want that, too. The football captain smiled, a small, tentative smile that felt like a breath of relief. Yeah, I think I'd like that. And with that, the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was peaceful, comfortable. There was a sense of understanding between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever was happening between them didn't need to be defined right away. It could be whatever they needed it to be, slow, steady, and free from the pressure of labels or expectations. As the night stretched on and the tension from earlier melted away, the football captain and the protagonist sat in companionable silence, each of them thinking about the strange, unexpected journey they had started together. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel the need to have everything figured out. What mattered now was that, in this moment, they weren't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the semester drew to a close, the protagonist and the football captain stood at the edge of something neither of them had expected, something real, something deeper than they could have imagined. Their journey from awkward roommates to unexpected friends was just the beginning of what could be a very different future. It was no longer about the tension that had once defined their relationship, but about the connection that had slowly but surely replaced it. Neither of them knew where this would lead, but for the first time, neither of them was afraid to find out. It was a reminder that sometimes, the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. And even if they didn't have all the answers, they were willing to take that next step, together. Now, as you've reached the end of this journey, we want to know your thoughts. Do you think the protagonist and the football captain's bond will survive beyond college? Could their unexpected connection lead to something even deeper? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any future stories that will tug at your heart and keep you coming back for more. Thank you for watching.